I'm a bit blown away by how astonishingly wonderful Tamsin's presentation of the reality of some of these issues is. And it reminds me of the kind of purpose that I wanted to talk today. And that's because I'm really worried still, been worrying since 2014, it's a long time, so we still have to keep talking about these issues, but I also want to kind of mobilise this each one thing in every conversation that I can have, because there must be people at the back who haven't heard yet, even though I feel like I've been saying the same thing for a long time now. So these are the key things that I think. Are there any policy or practice in schools which attempts to replace biological sex as a determinant of identity with notions of gender identity is really dangerous for the well-being of children, safety of children, and it needs to be robustly resisted. This is why I've lost all my jobs. But the idea of innate gender and identity, the idea that sex is a spectrum, is being taught under this wider remit of equalities and inclusion in school. It simply compounds confusion and compounds distress for children who are grappling with complicated ideas, and such as Tamsin was talking about gender and about identity and about who they are. So I am really worried about it. I really do think that we need to embolden ourselves to speak out, but I know that's a very hard thing to do. The central tenet of trans ideology, that children are the sex that they say they are, in my view, is a contrivance of academic gender theorists, and it frequently serves purposes of adult sexual entitlement. And since I don't have a job, I can tell you what I mean by that, which is, I think, transgender ideology in schools is seeking to naturalise ideas about sexuality in childhood to serve the purposes of particular adults, and it can also be used, and is also used for intensely homophobic purposes as well. And I think, I can't really understand why we can't talk about such egregious issues as that. We have government regulations in place that say that schools must avoid indoctrination, but gender ideology indoctrination is already embedded in schools and in classrooms, and teachers and families, children, caregivers are being compelled to accept its set of beliefs uncritically. And the marvellous Helen Lewis had a letter in an article in the newspaper yesterday about this, about trying to raise issues with her own son's school, which are pushed under the carpet, pushed away. Complacency about the seriousness of these issues and the difficulty of talking out. But I really think that we do have to keep talking out. Now, I know it's really difficult. I kind of half survived because of the support of allies like you here, but in your everyday classroom, in your everyday school, in your everyday neighbourhood, it is really difficult to keep facing a human resources committee, to think about life with your job and your salary and your pension all on the line is really difficult. But I think that the imperative to speak out is even more pressing now than when I started. The good thing, though, is that the evidence for the claims that I'm making is shoring up our position day by day, and that's a really important thing to hold on to. The evidence is growing, and I'm not going to regret the speaking out that I've done already, even though it has had this egregious impact on my life and career. So what's already happening? Well, in schools already, we see that schools are generally accepting the principle that young pupils wishing to switch their gender should be supported. There's acceptance of the idea that schools should have books about transgender identification on the curriculum, although if you look at the analysis of these books that's been conducted by Transgender Trend, much of that material is proposing the idea of transgender ideology to children. It's inductive, in my view. And even very young children, I'm finding, are being socially transitioned in schools. Children age 4, for example, and where a school reaches the view that parents may not be supportive of the child's transitioning, parents don't have to be told of what's happening to a child in their school. So all of this really worries me. I hear from parents all the time. I'm working with parents all the time about these issues. In Sheffield, we've been lobbying to raise questions with some of the schools that I've been involved with. What I'm usually told is this, that the school aims to prepare young people for adult life by ensuring students are taught the facts and the law about sex, sexuality, sexual health and gender identity in an age-appropriate and inclusive way. Well, that raises a whole series of red flags for me, because many of these schools invite external groups in to do that teaching, and these are not people who are trained teachers and who have particular understanding of children's cognitive and psychological developmental stages. And in fact, the whole issue of age appropriate becomes very moot, because children are told that they are the gender that they say they are. So in fact, the younger that you can tell a child that, the more likely that the idea is to be installed in their brain. So claims being made that all this teaching is done in an age-appropriate way, I think really need to be very robustly investigated. All that is needed for a child to be transitioned is for the child to say that they're a different gender to the one that they're being brought up as, but that doesn't make a child transgender. That makes a child who's saying certain things about gender, and those things are being reinforced by people who say certain things about gender as well, for which there is often no evidence base. So that really worries me, the idea that gender ideology in schools can incite children to understand gender preferences and suggest that they're not the biological sex that their parents may tell them they are. That's a really worrying proposition. I don't regret losing my job for raising that one. Now, the interim CAS review has established that gender expression is much more complicated. It's forged in the interactions between biological and cultural, social, psychological factors. The advice given to teachers by the lobby groups in schools is that no questions should be asked because children are expressing an inner and authentic truth. Yeah, Layla Moran told me that what teachers need to do is look into a child's soul. Yeah, not enough evidence for me there. Yeah. So at the moment, whatever concerns a teacher may have about a child articulating that they're the opposite sex, they can't ask questions, and they're supposed to kind of just go along with all of this. Well, I think that there are many questions to be asked. Now, this school that wrote to me most recently told me this: transgender is taught in the school during HUE lessons as part of an ethos of valuing everyone and caring for each other. Yeah? Well, actually, I don't believe that. I think that that's complete nonsense. I think that when Emily says she wants to be a boy called Leo, we need to ask her what is she finding difficult about being Emily. That's not conversion therapy, although you will be told that it is. But for me, it's in that question that the ethos of valuing everyone and caring for each other can be evidenced. Automatic affirmation that Emily is Leo because Emily says she is Leo does not confer value or care upon Emily. It does the exact opposite. It denies Emily value and care, and it confirms to her that Leo is valued and cared for, but not she. The affirmation of Emily's identification as Leo is not inclusive. It excludes Emily from her own biological sex class, and it alienates Emily from her own body and possibly her own family too. It erases Emily. This is at the root of my claim that my work is inclusive. It's not about excluding some children. It's about including children regardless of the struggles that they're facing, by looking at ways in which we can dismantle the struggles they're having in the world. This same school told me that when students are in the process of transitioning, they're invited to meet with relevant people in school and discuss how as a school we can support and care for them as individuals. Only when they're transitioning, yeah? Now, if we had had all that with Emily, we wouldn't be at this juncture of Emily's abject confusion and conclusion that she must embark on social transitioning, which we know will lead to medical intervention and a trajectory of lifelong harm. There isn't time to say everything that I wanted to say. But I think that gender identity and ideology in schools is ushering in a large-scale experiment on the minds and the bodies of our children. I'm working with detransitioners all over the world now who have been through this and are really struggling to come to terms with some of the experimentation that has been done in their minds and bodies. Teachers, I feel, are really at a critical juncture in schools. We've never before had ideologists with this kind of unrivaled access that gender identity ideologists have to our children now. My critique about gender identity ideology in schools is all about inclusion. But people say to me, you call yourself a professor of inclusive education, yet you won't be kind to these children. But I think that the notion of transitioning children is actually antithetical to a notion of genuine inclusion for the child that stands before you. I think that gender identityology in schools will deepen gender-based dissatisfaction. I used to say, if I'm right and gender identity is iatrogenic, now I say I am right, gender identity is iatrogenic, it comes from the things that people say, then I'm also right to say that we have to push for saying things differently. We have to raise questions, we have to get ourselves into trouble. But I'm not going to comply with the demands from activists and self-appointed petitioners of righteousness who have tried to silence me and to a certain extent succeeded. And I can't really believe that people who are recognised as arbiters of social justice and human rights and compassion and learning are not being permitted the ordinary grace that's sufficient to speak out for our children on the dangers of these things in school. But I ask you to be those people, to please stand with me and stand with everybody else who's trying hard to talk about this and dare to